The process of decentralization that started in the late 1970s or early 1980s was the consequence of the end of the developmental state. So these were reforms that were very functional to the market reforms that were also implemented at about that time. So if we are thinking about the causes of this process of decentralization, we see that neoliberalism, or the transition from a developmental state to a neoliberal state, was very important. Decentralization allowed government elites to shrink the state at the national level, to reduce the size of the state, and that was functional with the economic reforms that were implemented at the time. It also happened that it met the demands of civil society movements that were interested in democratization. Since some of the prior military regimes in the region had centralized power, decentralization was seen as part of the process that would democratize society as well. So there were different currents that met with different interests, but both on the right and the left, because of neoliberalism or because of democratization, found decentralization policies to be functional to their larger goals. When we think about the consequences of decentralization after 30 years in the region, what we see is wide variety. We see that it changes a lot depending on each context. So we have regions that are economically more developed or resourceful, where it's easier to implement administrative decentralization and be successful about it. Regions that perhaps are less endowed with resources or local capacity have more problem or find it more difficult to implement administrative decentralization. What I've also found in my research is that the sequence of reforms is important. This is to say, the order in time in which these reforms are undertaken matter greatly, mostly because the order in which different types of reforms are implemented or adopted is a reflection of the territorial coalitions and the political coalitions that are behind these reforms. So we see that countries that started with political decentralization reforms, that started by granting more political power and autonomy to their local governments, and then applied fiscal decentralization and lastly administrative decentralization, were more ended up with a situation in which local governments were given more autonomy and power. Instead, countries that started with an administrative type of reform, perhaps transferring the responsibility for schools or health, but sometimes without resources, without much autonomy, those countries ended up in a situation where local governments were not empowered. As a matter of fact, sometimes there were transfer problems more than anything else. So in my research, what I find is that this is a very political process in which the type of political and territorial coalitions that are at the beginning of the process are very important in deciding the type of reform that is first implemented. And that first type of reform, be political, administrative, or fiscal, it's also very important and consequential to determine the end results in terms of the autonomy of the subnational governments.